an extremely generous, probably over-generous introduction, but it is a real pleasure for me to be here. As you mentioned, as Kamal also mentioned, I have been very fortunate to have been at the founding of this program, the MSc program, at the time the syllabus was being discussed about 12 or 14 years ago, and have had the fortune to continue to be in touch, giving lectures to students, recruiting students into our PhD program at H3, interviewing them for jobs, and coming repeatedly to the TISS campus, except of course the last 2.5 years of, rather unfortunately for all of us, the break that we had because of the pandemic. So it's a double pleasure for me to be back on this campus. I think I can see from the faces in this room that everybody is really happy to be having an in-person engagement with this question of environment, climate change and sustainability, or just the very fact that we are all together and not on Zoom calls is itself quite something pleasurable for us. I'd like to begin by first of all congratulating the School of Habitat Studies and the Center for having seeded this program more than 10 years ago and started it in 2012 and run it successfully for 10 years. It is a remarkable achievement to have seeded a genuinely interdisciplinary program which crosses the social sciences and the natural science divide in a traditionally known as Institute of Social Sciences. I think that is a remarkable achievement that we should very strongly applaud. And it is not just that the program has been running for 10 years. The program has been sprinting in some sense from 10 students to, as they say now, alumni group of more than 150. And if you look at the numbers in terms of the applicants and the people admitted and so on, I think all of you should consider yourself extremely fortunate to have made it into this program this year, those of you who have entered this year, because this has become an extremely competitive program, and it ranks among the best in the country. I'm extremely privileged to be here today to celebrate the 10th year, be part of this 10th-year celebration of this program. And I'd like to congratulate Kamal, Geetanjoy, Unmesh, and all the other faculty, including the sister faculty from the other centers in the School of Habitat Studies, who are also here, for having made the School of Habitat Studies itself over the last decade or so flower in all these multiple directions, all linked to question of habitat, habitus, environment, largely interchangeable ideas and words. I'd like to begin by placing this program in a slightly historical context. So I was trying to trace which was the first MSc Environmental Science, MSc Environmental Anything program in the country. And I find that the School of Environmental Sciences was set up in Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi way back in 1974. This is 2 years after the Wildlife Act was passed and probably the year in which the Air and Water Act was passed. So these are all triggers coming from the 1972 Stockholm Conference, as you mentioned right in the beginning. We are in the 50th year after the first UN Conference on the Human Environment. And the trigger was it took the form of setting up the School of Environmental Sciences at JNU. Unfortunately, this program stopped for almost a decade and then restarted in 1987. In the meantime, the first MSc Ecology program started at the Salim Ali School of Ecology and Environmental Science in Pondicherry University in 1984. That's the year that I graduated from IIT Bombay. And subsequently, you will have seen a sprouting of MSc Environmental Science programs across the whole country. Now today I don't think there is a single university in the country that doesn't have an MSc Environmental Science program somewhere in its campus. There are even colleges that now boast of BSc Environmental Science programs. So you might say that environment has become mainstream. Over the last 30-40 years, we are really seeing the mainstreaming of environmental studies in academia, except that it's not environmental studies, it's environmental science. And therein lies part of the story that we all have to consider. And it's only in about 2003, which is similar to the time that we set up the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Environment and Development at the ISEC campus in Bangalore, that we see a broadening of this topic from environmental science to environmental studies in some form, environment and development studies, sustainability studies, and so on. So you have the Terry School set up in 2003, and where they launched the MSc Environmental Studies and MSc Environmental Management programs. Then you have Ambedkar University, Delhi, setting up the MA in Environment and Development as part of their School of Human Ecology. You have the TISS program in 2012 in Climate Change and Sustainability Studies. The Nalanda program, the Nalanda University program in 2014, it's called Ecology and Environmental Studies. A3 started its PhD in Conservation Science and Sustainability Studies in 2009. We didn't have a master's program till last year, where we have now started a program called Conservation Practice. You should not ask me what exactly that means, but we're still figuring it out. But you can see that all of this is after 2003, really. And this shift from pure environment science program, which mind you still continue. These environment science programs continue to exist, and in fact they outnumber the environmental studies programs or sustainability studies program by far. But nevertheless, you see the shift of a number of major universities, TERI, AUD, TISS, Nalanda, starting programs which are different from the traditional environmental science programs in the sense that they are interdisciplinary. And so if you look at the mission statement of the TISS program, the description of this program here, the program attempts to provide a base for further interdisciplinary research and learning on issues emerging from the interface of human society with the geophysical and the biological environment, both in the local and global sense. The emphasis is on understanding the ecological, the economic, and the socio-political sustainability of these interactions. And then it goes on to talk about the issues of economic development, poverty, human development, and equity in terms of their interlinkages with the environment. So this is a truly interdisciplinary framing of the problem. It tries to go beyond the idea that environmental problems, because they are discovered by environmental scientists, Rachel Carson discovered the presence of DDT in the food chain, and so on and so forth. Somebody else discovered, predicted climate. In fact, Arrhenius predicted climate change more than 100 years ago. So just because environmental problems, in terms of the process, the biophysical process that happens, that connects various elements of society, are often discovered by environmental scientists or natural scientists. Therefore, environmental problems are the domain of the natural sciences. This fallacy has been challenged in this framing of seeing the environmental problem as, or the sustainability problem as an interdisciplinary problem in its true sense, not interdisciplinary between soil science and botany and zoology, or zoology and geology, but really interdisciplinary as in crossing the big divide between the natural and social sciences. And I think this mission statement would by and large resonate with all the other programs that I cited that are offering MA or MSc in environmental studies or sustainability studies. And that the use of the word studies signifies the interdisciplinary nature, where you want to, if you say science, then you're effectively meaning natural science or physical science, and you're kind of boxing the program within that half of the knowledge stream. In implementing such programs, or holding them together in the face of many challenges, making them flourish, we all face a lot of challenges. And I say we because, as I say, UNITRI has had a PhD program in conservation science and sustainability studies for more than 12 years now. And all of us, in a sense, are kindred spirits trying to take the idea of environment and sustainability beyond the limited domain of the natural sciences into an interdisciplinary space. And in doing that, we face a lot of challenges. And we will face newer challenges as we enter 10 years of this program. And so, in trying to figure out what I would speak today, I thought I'd do a little bit of past and future perspective, not specifically looking at the TISS program, but looking at all such programs that exist in India or will try to exist in the future. What are the kind of challenges we have faced and we will face in the coming days? And the challenges, one might say, are of two kinds. One set of challenges are internal to academia. It's challenges that we ourselves, that is, academics themselves, have created in the way we have structured learning, structured knowledge, and therefore structured our thinking on environmental issues. And some challenges, of course, are external to academia, and I will come to that towards the end of the talk. But I will focus largely on the challenges within academia, and I think Manjula caught my thinking very, very quickly about the ideas of framing, which has been a favorite theme of mine, that how we limit our thinking because of the way we have learned certain things or the way we think about certain things. And so I'll be talking about the kind of hegemonic ideas that prevail in our thinking about environmental issues, some which have come more recently, some which have always existed, against which we have been struggling through the setting up of these interdisciplinary programs. So the first hegemony that I'd like to talk about is the hegemony of science, and here science means the natural and physical sciences. In fact, the very fact that the natural and physical sciences have essentially grabbed this term. So when anybody says science and technology, they don't mean social science and technology, right? They mean the natural science and technology or the physical sciences and technology. It's a given. So the word science, just by itself, has now been appropriated for a long time by the physical and natural sciences and to the exclusion of the social sciences. And this is something for us to reflect upon. And this disciplinary hegemony of the sciences, quote unquote, is reflected in this fact that the majority of the programs are environmental science and not environmental studies. In fact, if you do a Google search for MSc Environmental Studies, you will all land up at environmental science programs. It is also interesting that 20-30 years after the first environmental science programs were set up, they have not changed their character. They have not moved from their place in purely the natural sciences to a more interdisciplinary space. The School of Environmental Sciences at JNU continues to teach only environmental science. Pondicherry still teaches only ecology and environmental science. The Indian Institute of Science, where I went after my BTech, to look for a place to do environmental studies, and where the first Center for Ecological Sciences was set up in the year that I joined the Indian Institute of Science. The CES is still a Center for Ecological Sciences, and they added another center called the Center for Earth Sciences, but there is no Center for Environmental Studies in the premier science institute of this country, because they still continue to see the environmental problem through a science-y or a natural science-y lens. And it's fascinating that this is happening, or this continues to happen, while at the international level, the International Science Council now is the merged body of the physical, natural and social science councils across the world. So the International Science Council of the last 10 years has changed, and it has seen the importance of merging the social sciences with the natural and physical sciences. But here in our country in particular, we are still stuck in old ways of thinking in terms of that box called science is equal to natural science. Why is this so? As I said, the first thing is of course the thinking that environmental issues were highlighted by or understood by natural scientists. Environmental issues are natural science issues. And I would give some concession to that, in the sense that when we talk about what constitutes an environmental problem, what makes an environmental problem distinct from other social problems, I would argue that yes, it is distinct because the interactions between people are mediated by some biophysical process. So I pump water from a borewell, I deny my neighboring farmer water in their borewell. That's a biophysical linkage between my well-being and my neighbor's well-being. Or I pump water and deplete the aquifer, then future generations are denied access to that water. It's a biophysical linkage between my activities and outcomes that will be felt maybe 10 years down the road by somebody else. So in that sense, the person-to-person linkage is not direct. It's not through the act of, say, caste discrimination, where I exclude you from entering a temple or exclude you from entering a school of learning and so on and so forth, but from the biophysical linkage. It could be pollution, it could be resource extraction, it could be a variety of actions through which we people get linked. So there is an inextricable biophysical element. So the natural science dimension is necessary but not really sufficient to understand environmental problems. But this necessary aspect of the environmental problem has given natural scientists some kind of a privilege in terms of saying we define or we understand environmental problems, we flag them first, and we will come up with the solutions. The second reason why science or natural science becomes somewhat hegemonic is because of this false notion of objectivity. the idea that physics is objective, chemistry is objective, biology is objective, therefore environmental science is objective, and therefore the scientists are best placed to produce objective knowledge in what is otherwise a very contested, a very hotly debated, a very acrimonious debate around environmental issues, right? If an industry is polluting, it tends to get very acrimonious as to whether or not they are hurting somebody's health. If the US is emitting greenhouse gases, as we see, it's an incredibly acrimonious debate as to whether or not and to what extent they are responsible for climate change and what they should be doing about it. So there is this belief that, well, the sciences provide an objective point of entry and an objective way of understanding these problems and therefore coming up with solutions. And they will be, by being value neutral, they will in some sense take us out of this political, otherwise dirty politics of discussing and debating who's right and who's wrong and who's hurting whom how much and so on and so forth. So this idea that natural science generates objective knowledge is crucial to maintaining the hegemony of the natural sciences. And more generally, of course, we know that because we live in an era where science and technology have actually dramatically changed our lives, and we are all, I mean, the very fact that I'm using a PowerPoint and not using, for example, transparencies, OHPs, I don't know how many of you have even heard the term OHPs to present my talk. Science and technology has influenced our lives tremendously, and therefore science and technology hold an enormous sway in the minds of decision makers, saying, you know, we should just put money in science and technology and that will solve all our problems. This thinking predominates. So that's the economic power that science commands or technology commands is part of that hegemonical presence. And if at all you feel inclined to bring in a little bit of the social, then you quickly jump to the most objective social science, quote unquote, which is economics, because it is the most quantitative social science, because it aspires to be like physics, and therefore it must be like physics. If it aspires to quantify everything and use fancy mathematics, then it must be right. And this thinking then makes our environmental science courses, when they do make some gesture of, shall we say, obeisance to the social sciences, it is by adding a course in environmental economics to their curriculum. And that is the start and the end of all the social science interface that the environmental science courses typically have. So I think that is again, in a sense, even the addition of economics is reinforcing the hegemony of sciences, because it says you can only be called a science if you are quantitative, you have Hamiltonians and integrals in your theories, otherwise you are nowhere. And that belief, in a sense, is again reinforcing the idea that, well, science is all that matters and we don't need anything else. Now, this, in my description of the hegemony of the sciences, I have already hinted at what the fallacies are in this scientocratic view. And first and foremost, I think we must do away with the idea of objective science when it comes to environmental issues. It may be possible, my wife is an astrophysicist and we have these discussions about the nature of science, and it may be possible that when you're looking at stars, whether it is through the latest James Webb telescope or even your homemade telescope, you are arriving at some kind of an objective view of reality, because it's out there so far away that it may not really matter. You can't really attribute values to whether the universe is expanding or contracting and so on and so forth, because it doesn't have any immediate significance in your society. Even that claim might be somewhat questionable, but let's grant that idea that the basic sciences, whether it's physics, chemistry, or maybe even biology, to a large extent are value free, in that sense objective, within certain limits. But environmental problems are problems in a very different sense. They are problems. The word problem here, when we say environmental problems, we don't mean puzzles. We don't mean questions like, is the universe contracting or expanding? Questions which have no significance in terms of our daily lives. We mean problems as in somebody is getting hurt. It's a problem in a very value-loaded sense, that it's actually hurting somebody or something that we value. Something that we value is declining or not adequately achieved. That's why we call it a problem. So there it's a problem as seen through the lens of some values. Poverty is a problem. Exclusion is a problem, because it hurts a particular value that we hold, that people should not be poor or people should not be excluded. It's only when we hold those values that we come to the conclusion that poverty is a problem or exclusion is a problem, right? And therefore, all environmental problems in that sense are extremely value-laden. We should save the tiger. This should statement does not emanate from biology. It emanates from our own value systems. Whether it's a traditional value system where the tiger is part of some religious notion, or whether it's a modern value system where the tiger is seen as something beautiful or having a right to live on its own. The second reason why, of course, the scientific view is fallacious is because of the fact that all environmental problems, even if they have biophysical processes mediating them, have social roots. Right? And so we cannot actually solve any problem just by understanding the biophysical side. We cannot just understand GHG emissions and how they create climate change to really understand why we have GHG emissions in the first place. Why do some people consume at the rate of 20 tons of CO2 per capita per year and somebody else is at 2 tons of CO2 per capita per year? Or why is somebody's emissions coming down and somebody else's emissions going up, and so on and so forth. We will never understand that through a purely technical or biophysical lens. Environmental problems have social roots, and therefore we need the social sciences to help us understand why they occur and therefore what might be some of the ways to solve or address them. The third dimension, which is a bit harder for natural scientists and technologists to swallow, is that in fact science and technology might be part of the problem. It's not just that they provide a partial understanding of the problem, but they are actually sometimes part of the problem. The fact that somebody invented DDT and tested it in terms of its efficacy for mosquito control, but did not test the efficacy or its impact on the food chain or on human health, is itself a sign of reductionist science. The problem was not just, it didn't just happen. DDT didn't just happen, it didn't exist before we created it. And so how come when we did the creation of DDT as a very conscious human task, we didn't ask questions about what it might do in the larger environment? And this is just one of thousands and thousands of chemicals that we have created over the last 50 years, especially post World War II, but even before that. And all kinds of other technologies that we have let loose, where we, 30 years later, 40 years later, we start scratching our heads and, oops, by the way, it has some, environmental side effects that may not be so great. So why is it that the scientific and technological enterprise produces such outcomes? That's something for us to reflect upon, and therefore see reductionist science and inappropriate technology, to coin a phrase, or the belief that technology solves all problems, and in its kind of mirror image, the building of economics as a physics of society, also as problematic for its reductionism. And so all three of these contribute to the environmental problem. They are not just partial explanations of the environmental problem. In fact, just the other day I had the opportunity to visit one of the premier national labs under the CSIR in this country, and I was looking at their mission statement, and they said basically their mission was to increase the wealth of society. So, even 75 years after independence, we have not thought it worthwhile to actually maybe change or revisit that mission statement, to maybe think in terms of poverty reduction, maybe in terms of inclusive wealth, maybe in terms of sustainable livelihoods or sustainable enhancement of people's well-being. These phrases, which have been around for a while in the discourse, have not yet made it to our premier technology labs. So that their goals are still defined in terms of the wealth of society, and the operationalization of this goal takes the form of the number of patents you produce, the number of companies that you have tie-ups with, and the number of companies that then make money from the inventions that the nationally funded lab produces. So that's our definition of how we evaluate publicly funded technology labs in terms of their worthwhileness. And therefore we need not only just the descriptive social science which might tell us how environmental problems occur, but also the critical social sciences, which, and Manjula's introduction is a classic example of that, make us reflect upon how we are even thinking about these problems. Make us reflect on the values that are embedded in our definition of environmental problems, what is being highlighted, what is being held back, how are we even talking about environmentalism in the first place. That itself is an area of inquiry for the critical social sciences, and I think that dimension of the social sciences adds tremendous value and is a necessary part of our inquiry or our understanding of the environmental question. So, from all these perspectives, the purely scientocratic, the purely natural sciencey understanding of the environment falls really short. Unfortunately, over the last 50 years, the social sciences haven't quite covered themselves with glory when it comes to understanding environmental problems. Granted that the natural sciences provide a limited understanding. Granted that sometimes they are part of the problem and not part of the solution. How have we interfaced with the social sciences? With the natural sciences. And I think our emotions or our ways of interacting with science and technology have ranged from fear to neglect to disdain of these dimensions of knowledge. And I think it's all been to the detriment of a truly interdisciplinary understanding of the problem. So one thing I've seen is that many social scientists have come to me when I've talked about interdisciplinarity and said, well, we find it really difficult. We find it really difficult to understand the environmental science side of the story. It's very complicated. We don't have degrees in ecology. You are lucky you did an engineering undergrad and then moved into the interdisciplinary domain of sustainability studies and environmental studies. But we did the straight social science pathway from high school onwards. And so we dropped maths probably after 10th standard. We dropped all sciences after 12th standard. And so how do you expect us to understand the science dimension? So we just treat it as a black box. And I think this kind of it's a combination of fear and ignorance about the other, which really holds back a truly interdisciplinary inquiry or the engagement of the social sciences with these questions. Because sometimes, and a classic example is how even economists who pride upon being not afraid of quantitative analysis, how do they actually look at water? Well, usually water is just added as one more factor in their production function. So you just add one more variable and you forget about it. But water can show up in agriculture through a borewell, it can show up in agriculture through a canal, it can show up in agriculture through rain, it can show up in agriculture through a check dam, and a variety of different ways and technologies that are deployed in order to make water available in the farm will hugely influence the amount of water that's available, the timing with which you can provide it to the crop, and so on and so forth. So understanding agronomy, understanding hydrology, and understanding how water that's naturally flowing ends up in the farm through human-made structures is an essential dimension of us understanding agriculture, even if ultimately we want to link it to social problems, whether it's the agrarian crisis, whether it is the question of production, whether it is the question of distribution, and so on and so forth, right? So unfortunately, most of the time we treat the science and technology side of the story, whether it's the ecology, whether it's the chemistry, whether it's the agronomy, or whether it's the hydrology, either as a black box, or we take these natural scientists' words at face value. And I think it's not just that we need to understand the ecology or understand the hydrology, but we as in the social scientists need to question sometimes the given ideas from the natural sciences. And one simple example that I'd like to share with you, it's a very nice example. We were running a one-day training program on hydrology for social scientists. The Indian Society for Ecological Economics, of which I am a founding member, had for many years in its pre-conference workshops run these kinds of cross-disciplinary efforts. And so in this hydrology workshop, we had a groundwater hydrologist from the Central Groundwater Board come and tell us, very nice presentation on watershed development and the fact how you can make water walk instead of run, and put in check dams and put in all kinds of structures so that the water infiltrates more rather than just running off on the surface of land, and thereby making it more available for farming. And it took a social scientist in the audience, an economist, to ask this question. So you create check dams, you infiltrate water, what happens to the water after that? Well, of course, then the farmers pump that water from their wells and irrigate multiple crops instead of maybe doing the single crop that they were doing earlier. Now more water is available for multiple cropping. So the social scientist said, well, what would have happened if the farmer hadn't done this additional pumping? Then the water would have gone downstream and emerged somewhere as base flow in the river during the dry season. So then he said, well, then watershed development is not necessarily a good thing, because you're basically appropriating water upstream and then denying water downstream during the summer months. So it's not an sort of a undiluted good thing. And the CGWB hydrologists just refused to accept the idea that watershed development or water conservation or through these watershed development activities could be a mixed blessing. For him, it was just the right thing to do because more infiltration is good, period, end of story. Right? More recharge to groundwater is good, period, end of story. So, this engagement of the social sciences is not just about understanding the ecology or the hydrology or the chemistry, but also questioning some of those framings that emerge when those sciences interact with real world problems, which are, as I said, always normatively loaded. Whose water is it? Is a question that we have to understand, which we will not understand from purely hydrological perspective. The other kind of reaction that we have seen is sort of rejecting modern science and saying, well, indigenous knowledge is good enough and it takes care of everything and it's wonderful and beautiful and quite self-contained and so on and so forth. And my observations, since I work in the fields of both forests, water, and to an extent pollution, is that there is a varying contribution that indigenous knowledge can make to these questions. So in the forest question, for example, I would say indigenous knowledge is incredibly important and has a very large amount of contribution to make because people have been interacting with forests and using forest products for millennia, and that knowledge still holds good. When it comes to the field of water, for instance, things change a little bit because large dams have been built only 200 years ago, starting 200 years ago, and borewells came into being in any significant way only about 50 years ago. And it's very difficult for somebody who has been using, let us say, an open well which runs to about 60 feet deep and may have some traditional knowledge about how those open wells function or where that water, during what season, how much water seeps in and seeps out and so on and so forth, to really be able to say what's happening in a borewell of a hole of diameter 10 inches which goes 1000 feet deep, as the borewells in my neighboring Kolar district or even in Bangalore district typically do. It's just impossible for traditional knowledge to penetrate that deep to into that the lithosphere in way and understand that, given that these borewells are only 50 years old or 20 years old in that technology, right? So I think we have to take the idea of ILK, indigenous and local knowledge, carefully, enable its use wherever possible, but not at the same time valorize it to the point of rejecting modern science and technology altogether. And remember that this is distinct from the idea of citizen science or just the validity of local perceptions and observations, which is always important. I mean, when we visit coal mine areas, we see the amount of soot and the amount of particulate matter that's out there without necessarily having to measure it in any fancy 5 crore air quality meters. And this is what local people are telling you, that the air is really polluted. And you don't need those meters, and if your meters are giving you readings which are showing that air quality is quite acceptable, then there's possibly something wrong with equipment and not something wrong with people's perceptions. So the perceptions, the observations, maybe more systematic observations done through citizen science are absolutely fundamental or absolutely will add something of value. But it's not the same for knowledge, as in the causality of whether it's disease, whether it's chemical impacts of chemicals that didn't even exist 50 years ago, and so on and so forth. I think we cannot say that indigenous knowledge covers all these domains. And I think therefore if we resort to kind of the rejection of modern science and technology, even while I acknowledge that they are part of the problem, reductionist science and inappropriate technology are part of the problem, we cannot translate that into a wholesale rejection. And similarly, a wholesale rejection of economics thinking will not really get us very far. And therefore my last point about interdisciplinarity is that for us to be truly interdisciplinary, we have to be inclusive in our thinking. And one way of sifting the wheat from the chaff is to always look at the outcomes, look at solutions, saying how do we solve problems, and in solving problems, what all kinds of knowledge do we need? Rather than saying, I do sociology, therefore all problems are amenable to, they may be amenable to a sociological analysis, but the solution may not adequately be arrived at with only that kind of analysis, and that's true for every discipline. So we need to bring in multiple disciplines to arrive at solutions, even though partial analysis are possible, they are publishable, you will get significant t values, to use a statistical term, but you may not actually cover most of the R square in the regression. Your R squares might be still very small. So in that sense, you will have a partial understanding which is valid but you need to integrate that with other kinds of understandings if you want to solve the problem. In passing, or I'd like to mention that even in our sort of very simple parlance about environmental problems, we often reproduce these disciplinary divides. And the example I like to give, the one thing that really gets me going always, is when people talk about, now we have understood that environmental goals have to be integrated with social and economic goals. So we have got environmental goals, social goals and economic goals as three separate things that we are trying to integrate. Or in simpler parlance, people say people, planet and profits. This is your triple bottom line. This is the kind of language that is quite common out there. And it's, maybe you would say for the common person it's an easy way of understanding what we mean by saying we need to have a holistic sort of set of societal goals. But if we use this kind of language frequently enough, as Manjula said, you repeat it often enough, then you start thinking along those lines. So we still think of them as sociology separate from ecology and separate from economics, and I think that's really a problem, because both ecology and descriptive economics are descriptions of the real world, as is sociology, and they don't provide us goals. To say ecological goals is actually a misstatement, because ecology has nothing to tell us about goals. It's a description of what's happening out there. Which species have symbiotic relationships, which species have competitive relationships, what else is happening between species and their resources in their abiotic world. That's all they are telling us. They do not give us goals. Ecology does not tell us that we should save the tiger or the lion or the leopard or the whatever. It is we who hold values from which we then decide to save something. And if we do decide, for example, to translocate the cheetah from Africa to India, then ecologists might have something to tell us in terms of whether it will work out or not, and what it might cost in terms of maybe they will actually create havoc among the local cattle or something, or they might die because of certain diseases. So ecology can then tell us what might happen. But the idea of relocating the cheetah or not expanding the terrain of the lion from Gir to other parts of India comes from us, comes from our values, comes therefore from something other than just the science. And therefore to call goals as ecological goals is really deceptive, because what it then does is that it sort of puts onus on ecologists to produce those goals, and then by definition ecologists, because we always end up liking what we study. If I study insects, I start liking insects. If I study tigers, I start liking tigers. If I study paints, I will start liking chemical paints, and I will say chemical paints are really great. And so on and so forth. That's just the nature of life. And therefore, the ecologists will have the onus of saying what we should do in terms of setting goals on the environmental front. And I think that's really a problem, both for the ecologists and for society. And it creates this separation that somehow society is different, societal goals are different, people's goals are different, economic goals are different, and ecological or environmental goals are different. But in fact, all of these are really about societal well-being. Everything is about societal well-being, whether the quantum of well-being, the content of well-being. Is our well-being defined by living in concrete jungles, or is our well-being defined by living, for example, closer to nature? Distribution of that well-being in space and its continuation over time, all of these are about societal well-being. And the different dimensions of well-being, whether the distributional dimension, the intertemporal dimension, the content, they all have environmental components, as in the biophysical environment, and of course they have social components in terms of how societal relations determine this well-being. So I think we need to also, when we, even in popular parlance, start talking about the triple bottom line, I think we need to be very careful of not, in a sense, propagating this notion that the social, the ecological and the economic are three separate spheres. Let me now come to the second kind of hegemony, which is the hegemony of the sustainability term. And therefore it was heartening to see that the Climate Change and Sustainability Studies program consciously expanded to the Environment, Climate Change and Sustainability Studies, because I think in a sense it draws attention to the fact, something that the Climate Change program here has been drawing attention for the last 10 years, namely that climate change is not just a sustainability problem. And why would I say that, or why would they say that? Because if you really dig into the semantics of sustainability and what it conveys, it's about the future. it's about sustaining something, sustaining well-being, let us say, over time. We are worried that we will run out of resources in the future. We are worried that we will run out of space for pollutants to be absorbed in the environment in the future, and so on and so forth. So sustainability is really about the future. It doesn't tell you what is to be sustained, and it says nothing about the distribution of well-being today or impacts created by environmental processes today. But it has been very seductive. It's become extremely popular, and post the Brundtland Commission's report, Our Common Future in 1987, you see the proliferation of this idea where now sustainability is equal to environment. And in fact, we see that in the West, in the US particularly, the idea of environmental studies has been supplanted with the idea of sustainability science. So sustainability science was created as a new kind of very applied problem-solving discipline or effort to bring together people who work on the environment. But the idea that they chose to use the word sustainability and not something else hints as to why it is why was it so comfortable for them to use the word sustainability. It's because sustaining future generations, this is my hypothesis, I don't necessarily have proof for it, but I often see that people are comfortable with the word sustainability because sustaining future generations often means sustaining my future generations. It's my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren that I'm concerned about and whose future I'm ensuring, and not necessarily ensuring the future of the grandchildren of my slum-dwelling neighbor or some poor person in some sub-Saharan Africa. That is not the person, the well-being that I'm trying to sustain. So people latch onto this because this is actually a somewhat selfish form of concern as compared to the idea of justice, for instance. And if you look at the nature of environmental problem, and this is something that I've spoken about at TISS earlier also, if you look at the nature of environmental problems, many environmental issues are actually justice issues. You just need to walk on the street and ask somebody this question, that if there is a river and an industry dumps pollutants into the river and somebody downstream drinks that polluted water and dies, what kind of a problem is it? Why is it a problem at all? And they might struggle a little bit with saying, well, this is obvious, it should not be happening, blah, blah, blah. When you try to pin them down in terms of words, what kind of a word would you use to describe this as a problem? They would say, in English they would say it's unfair. In Marathi we just use a vague word like te barobar nahi. We don't necessarily say anyaya, but that's the idea really, that it's not fair for somebody else to dump pollutants in a river and hurt somebody else downstream who had nothing to do with that activity in the first place. I think that sense of fairness is very strongly embedded in people's thinking, even if they use different words. But somebody will say justice, somebody will say fairness, somebody will say inequity or whatever. But the idea that one person's actions negatively affect another person's well-being through the biophysical linkage is unfair, is unjust, is inequitable. It's very clear. Nobody is going to use the word unsustainable. Nobody will say it's unsustainable for the industry to pollute and kill people downstream, because the industry could keep doing that for the next 100 years and people could keep dying and nothing might happen, unless people really unite and kind of confront the industry through political action, not through environmental action, because the water always flows from upstream to downstream. So the people downstream can also add pollutants to the river, but that's not going to hurt the factory upstream, because the pollutants are not going to go in the other direction. The same is true of air pollution and so on and so forth, right? So there are many issues, particularly pollution issues, or even water resource issues. So if I divert a river upstream, like in the state of Karnataka that I come from, if we dam the Kaveri more, we are denying water to Tamil Nadu downstream. Tamil Nadu will do anything it wants with the remaining water. It's not going to hurt the state of Karnataka, because the damming in Tamil Nadu is not going to affect availability in Karnataka. So the sharing of water in the river, upstream and downstream, is an issue of fairness and equity. It's not an issue of sustainability at all. Whichever way you share that water, the water in the river will continue to flow. Whether you build dams or don't build dams, whether you build the dams upstream or build the dams downstream, whether you build small dams or large dams, it makes no difference to the flow of the river as a whole, because the flow of the river is determined by how much it rains in the catchment. Of course, in different parts of the river, you will see different flows because of the dams. But the sharing question is an equity question. So in the water context, really speaking, the sustainability question is a very small part of the whole story. Whether it's pollution or whether it is resource issues around water, it's all about equity and justice. You bring water from the Kaveri 100 kilometers to Bangalore, or you bring water from the 6 lakes around Bombay into the city. Now the question comes, how should that water be shared? How much should go to the slums? How much should go to the high rises? Who should pay how much? Should everybody be charged an equal rate for water? Should there be any concessional pricing for the poor, etc., etc.? So it's all again about sharing. It's all about equity. It's not about sustainability. It's true that in diverting water from the Vaitarna or the Tansa and so on, those streams have dried up downstream of that dam. That's a fact. But that's again equity. Should the fish get the water or should Bombay get the water? That's an equity question between humans and non-humans. It's not about sustainability. Of course, the fish are going to die if you dry up the river, but so the sustainability of the fish is at stake. But the point I'm trying to make is really so much of environmental issues are around questions of equity and justice. About here and now. My actions here now affecting your present, not your future, not my future either. And that we need to, there are of course other issues which has some more sustainability dimensions, there are more intertemporal in nature, but they always also have justice dimensions. And this climate change program here has been at the forefront, even if they use the word climate change and sustainability studies, has been at the forefront of telling us that the climate change problem is both a sustainability problem and a justice problem. Because neither is the producer of the climate change problem everybody in the world. Different people have contributed very differently to creating that problem, and therefore the responsibilities are very different, and the impacts of climate change are also going to be extremely different. If you live in coastal areas, you're going to get hit by sea level rise. If you are living in the tropics, you're going to get hit by temperature rise. But if you live in Siberia, you're actually better off with climate change, because then the permafrost is gone and you can access the land and do cultivation and do a whole bunch of things that you could never have dreamt of till maybe 20 years ago. So in fact, Siberians are benefiting from climate change. So the impacts of climate change are extremely inequitably distributed across the world. And even within a location, again, if there is a heat wave in Delhi, as we saw in the last summer, 47 degrees across the board, everybody is facing 47 degrees. But is everybody dying? No, because somebody has air conditioners and somebody doesn't, right? So there's a huge difference in our capacity to even withstand those problems. And therefore climate change has enormous equity and justice dimensions, both in terms of who created it, who's responsible for it, and who's going to face higher or lower impacts. All of these are equity and justice dimensions, even though there is clearly an intertemporal dimension to climate change, because the emission of greenhouse gases does not produce climate change instantaneously. It produces climate change over a 10-year period, over a 20-year period, and conversely, if we shut off GHG emissions today, we would still have a climate change problem for the next 100 years at least, because it is built up over the last 200 years, right? So there is a clear intertemporal dimension, therefore there is a clear sustainability dimension. There is a clear sense that we are all contributing to climate change at some level and jeopardizing our future generations, but at the same time it has all these justice and equity dimensions as well. So I think there is not a single environmental issue. Let's say you look at the declining of groundwater aquifers. We say it's a sustainability problem. Groundwater sustainability is jeopardized when we overpump. But it's never without the equity dimensions. Who's pumping and who's suffering? So the rich farmers are pumping 5 borewells, and the drinking water borewell in the Gram Panchayat has dried up, which was the sole source of drinking water for everybody in the village, and so on and so forth. Every sustainability problem has justice dimensions, and therefore I think we must very seriously question the equation of environmental problems with sustainability, or the saying that if we do sustainability studies, we will actually be doing environmental studies. I think we need to get out of that straitjacket and really think in terms of a broader idea of the nature of environmental problems, which include environmental justice, which include the question of conservation or the rights of non-human beings, and of course the question of future, the rights of future generations. The second example of hegemony that I'd like to, this is the third example, is the idea of frameworks. And I'd like to take the example of planetary boundaries as a framework. How many people have heard the term planetary boundaries? Okay, so hopefully those of you who are new to this sphere will hear about planetary boundaries in the course of the next couple of years. So the idea of planetary boundaries was proposed by Johann Rockström and others in 2007, when they argued that we are really entering a completely different epoch, and this sort of coincides with the coining of the phrase Anthropocene. How many people have heard the phrase Anthropocene? Yeah, many more. So Anthropocene can be seen as a popular version of the idea of planetary boundaries. What it is saying is that if the Anthropocene idea is that we were in the Holocene, but now over the last century or so, we have so transformed the face of the earth and the functioning of the earth system, the planetary system, that we are now entering a new era in geological time, which we should call Anthropocene, because it's dominated by human activities. All the earth system functions are being modified heavily by human activities, human actions. That's the idea of the Anthropocene. How does it relate to planetary boundaries? The planetary boundaries idea is that in these 7 spheres, climate change, they now introduce something else called novel entities, stratospheric ozone, atmospheric aerosols, ocean acidification, biochemical flows, fresh water, land use, and biodiversity. I think it's already gone beyond 7 because they keep changing these numbers or tweaking the subsets. Nevertheless, the idea is that in all these dimensions of the Earth system, which is the movement of greenhouse gases, the presence of stratospheric ozone, etc., there are some natural boundaries. The Holocene is characterized as a period during which life on Earth for human beings has been extremely favorable conditions, has had very convenient for us to survive and flourish during this period. And the boundaries of this, in terms of temperature, in terms of precipitation, in terms of, let's say, the violence of storms, extreme events, and so on and so forth, are such that it enables human beings to flourish. If we cross those boundaries, we will be in serious trouble. And so they are trying to define these boundaries not just in terms of the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but also in terms of all the other dimensions, such as the flows of phosphorus and nitrogen, the extent of acidification of the oceans, the presence of aerosols, the extent of freshwater use, and so on, saying that each and every one of these has an upper limit or a lower limit, however you put it, right? And that if we cross those thresholds, then we are going to reach what are called global tipping points, and when we reach those tipping points, we will really have a crash. The Earth system will start malfunctioning big time and affect everybody on this planet. That's the kind of idea behind planetary boundaries. Boundaries or limits, tipping points beyond which we should not go if we want the human race to survive. So it's pitching the idea of survival, sheer survival of the human race as sort of the the reason why we should be worrying about this. Now, there are a lot of positive things about the planetary boundaries idea. One is, of course, that it's very cute and easy to understand when you say there are these thresholds. We need to stay within these thresholds if human life has to flourish on this planet. It's kind of nice. The diagram itself is pretty cute. It is more sophisticated than what the limits to growth folks predicted in the 1972 Club of Rome report, where they said we will run out of resources. We'll run out of cultivable land, we'll run out of water, etc. And those predictions did not come true, because their prediction was that in 30 years the whole Earth system was going to crash because of a resource crunch. But we are not seeing a resource crunch, we are seeing actually more and more resources being used. And the new thinking in environmental science is that it is not going to be a resource crunch, it's going to be the shortage of pollution absorption capacities in various ways, in the capacity to absorb CO2, in the capacity to absorb various kinds of chemicals and so on and so forth, in water, in air, in land and so on, in ecosystems, which is going to be the constraint for human life to flourish. And so it is a sophisticated or a replacement of the limits to growth idea. So that's a positive point. And it is multidimensional and in that sense better than the ecological footprint concept. Because the ecological footprint concept tries to convert resource consumption into a land footprint. All resource consumption is then converted into some kind of equivalent land hectares and saying that, oh, we are consuming three Earths, 3 planets worth of resources, 4 planets worth of resources. Again, it's nice and scary, but not necessarily grounded in a very good science. So, this is a more sophisticated idea because it keeps the 7 dimensions or 8 dimensions separate. It doesn't say that each dimension is kind of collapsible into the other. It's got 7 different thresholds or 8 different thresholds that it is flagging. But it is clearly scientifically untenable, at least in some of its dimensions. So whereas one can really think of climate change as a truly global problem or a truly global environmental process, because any ton or any kilogram of CO2 emitted anywhere on the face of the earth ends up in the atmosphere. The atmosphere is well mixed, therefore it ends up anywhere in the atmosphere and it creates the same impact in terms of triggering additional climate change no matter where it was emitted from. So in that sense, the emission process is global, the mixing is global, and the impacts are global. Even though, as I said, there are varied impacts in terms of who will face sea level rise and who will face glacier melt and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, at one level, global warming is a global impact. But that's not necessarily true of other problems that they have included here. To take one example, biodiversity. To even conceive of biodiversity as a global good or as a global thing is itself problematic. Because frankly, if the tigers in India disappear, it really does not physically affect anybody living in North America or South America or Europe or anything of that kind. If the elephants disappear here, it's not going to affect anybody else's life. If the cheetah in Africa disappears, it's not going to affect any Indian in any material way. So I may say, no, but I love the cheetah in Africa, I love the whale in the Arctic, and I love the bald eagle in the US, and my well-being will be affected if the bald eagle goes extinct. That's a social construct, much more than the idea of climate change. So the idea of biodiversity as being a global public good is a complete social construct. And then to say that there are thresholds. So how do you define a threshold? The extinction threshold for a tiger is completely different from the extinction threshold for an African elephant or the whale or something else. And to say that, well, if X amount of biodiversity, as they have said, genetic diversity. Now genetic diversity is even more complicated and localized concept. Because genetic diversity says that it's not enough to have many tigers. It says that you need to have genetic diversity within the tiger population so that you don't get inbreeding depression, and therefore the tiger population does not go extinct on its own because of inbreeding and the kind of problems that inbreeding might cause. That's the idea of genetic diversity. Now what has that got to do with the genetic diversity of the bald eagle? Nothing. And therefore to say that genetic diversity also there is some kind of a global threshold is just a concoction. But we are being fed this concoction that somehow biodiversity also is a global public good, and there is a one threshold that we can define for the whole planet in terms of the kind of biodiversity that should exist and the kind of consequences that might trigger for the whole globe. So effectively what you are saying is that if biodiversity, let's say for example, one of the most biodiverse regions in the world is Central Africa. So if biodiversity, the wildlife of Central Africa is completely decimated. The giraffes are gone, the zebras are gone, the gazelles are gone, the wildebeest are gone, the cheetah and the lions are gone. Somehow the entire planet is going to be affected. That's effectively the message that is being conveyed. But there is no science behind that kind of a message. The same thing holds true for freshwater use. Again, it's a construct to sort of take the total global availability of fresh water, divide by the population and come up with some number and say, well, this global availability is going down and we need to worry about it. Because frankly, Bangalore is facing water problems every year, but that's not even affecting Bombay, let alone New York or London or Paris, right? They have their own water resources, we have our own sources of water, and there is scarcity in one part of the world and plenty in another part of the world. Of course, there is some amount of virtual water trade that's happening across boundaries when, for example, India foolishly exports sugar to the world in the process, in a sense, it's exporting water, because people are benefiting in the other parts of the world from a water consumptive crop which they themselves could not grow, but Indians who are suffering water scarcity are growing this crop for their consumption. So yes, there is some amount of that happening, but water is still, in terms of freshwater flows for human use, not freshwater flows in general. Freshwater flows for human use, water is a local and regional resource. And one river basin might be completely depleted or destroyed or polluted and will still not affect another river basin. Certainly not in the first order, not in the second order, maybe in the third order, where the flows from the river don't end up in the ocean and therefore trigger some climatic changes that might increase or decrease precipitation in some other part of the world, but in some very second, third order kind of sense. So the freshwater use, if one particular area crosses the threshold in freshwater use, that has no consequences for some other part of the world. But it's again a construct that there is something like a global planetary boundary for freshwater use. And land system change is the most hilarious one of these concepts, because land systems, by definition, there is nothing good or bad about land systems. You can say freshwater is something we need. Human beings need fresh water. Human beings want climate to be within a certain range of variability. But what is it about land systems? So land use changes might lead to GHG emissions if you have deforestation. They might lead to increased or decreased transpiration depending upon what kind of crops you grow or what kind of vegetation you replace. By itself, the idea is to somehow say that there was a particular combination of forests, agriculture and grasslands that was out there, and we should somehow freeze the face of the earth to look like that combination of forests, agriculture and grassland forever, right? So again, this is a complete construct and also politically dangerous. And why is it politically dangerous? Because first of all, in constantly thinking about global problems, we forget that there's already local overshoot happening which has already devastated communities in many parts of the world. Whether it is drought in one area, floods in another area, pollution in the third area, or deforestation in the fourth area for mining, and so on and so forth. There's enormous amount of local environmental bads that are already crossed local thresholds, where people are dying or people are facing morbidity, or biodiversity has completely disappeared without the global boundary being crossed. And so if you wait till the global boundary is crossed, then what about all these communities and all these people who are already suffering, right? So that's the first problem, that the local overshoots are ignored. It reinforces the narrative of we are all in the same boat. And that's been the problem of the sustainability narrative. We are all in the same boat, which means we should all contribute to solving the problem, and then in brackets contribute equally, which means the belt tightening that has to happen has to be shared by everybody. So if I am at 3 tons of CO2 emissions per capita per year, as India is actually at 2.5, or the US is at 18 tons per CO2 per capita per year, both must do equal amount of belt tightening. And the latest environmental performance index put out by Yale and Columbia, for instance, said anybody who decreases CO2 emissions gets plus points. Anybody who increases CO2 emissions gets minus points. So your environmental performance of India is always going to be bad, because we are never going to be able to go below 2.5. We will always be rising. The question is rising slowly or rising fast, and rising till what point. And we are still at 2.5 and somebody is at 18, but the US went from 18 to 16, that becomes a plus point. And India went from 2.5 to 3, that becomes a minus point, right? Because we haven't decided how to apportion the carbon space in the first place. So this idea that we are all in the same boat, we have all therefore we have shared responsibility for the problem, gets reinforced by this framing of it as a global problem, and that's been also the criticism of the Anthropocene concept. Because to say human beings have transformed the face of this planet, irretrievably or dramatically, is to hide the question of which human beings. It completely wipes out the question of which human beings have done the transformation. Human beings have done this. Is climate change anthropogenic? Yes, it is. But anthropogenic again is a homogenizing term. It means you, me, sub-Saharan Africa, and the person driving an SUV in the US, we are all the same. We are all human beings. And climate change is anthropogenic, so we are all responsible. So that's the kind of framing, that's the kind of insidious thinking that this promotes. And thirdly, it reinstates the hegemony of objective science. Now what it does is it creates and it adds the hegemony of global science. I'm going to club these 2 points. Because now if you see the journal Nature or the journal Science, which are the top two journals in the natural and physical sciences, it is impossible to publish an environment related paper unless you have glossy maps of the earth and all your analysis is done at a global scale. If you have a global hunger map, it will be publishable. If you have a global freshwater scarcity map, it will be publishable. But a local problem from the polluted river in Bangalore, that is not publishable, because that's really not global science anymore. And all science has to be global. Environmental science has to be global now, because problems are all global. And it gives them again sort of reinforces or reinstates the hegemony of the global north. The scientists from the global north who have the remote sensing resources, the modeling resources, the computer resources, and the money to sit in Washington DC, London or Paris and to talk about global environmental problems. Whereas this poor environmental scientist from Bangalore is studying that dirty river, in his backyard, because that is pretty polluted and pretty bad, but that doesn't count, right? So the hegemony of a global north science doing global work, while we all are local guys doing local work, that disparity is again strengthened, because global science suddenly becomes more important than local science. And I think that's really something for us to be worried about. And the fourth example I have of a hegemony is the combination of values, frameworks and solutions. And that's conservation, environmental services or ecosystem services and nature-based solutions as the current buzzwords. And I don't know how much time I have, Gitendra. I think I'm probably already towards exceeding my time, but I'd like to run through this example very quickly. So if you have not come across the idea of ecosystem services, you will fairly soon in your master's program, which is this ecosystem services framework put out by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005, which basically says that on the left hand side you have life on earth, which is equated to biodiversity, which is interesting in and of itself, and that this life on earth, the biota on earth, produce ecosystem services, provisioning services, regulating services and cultural services, which then, I'm sorry if it's not completely decipherable, which then on the right hand side produce well-being, human well-being, and they have different constituents of human well-being and so on. And this is the core of the ecosystem services framework, the idea that nature, as in living nature, as in biota, produce human well-being. Therefore, what are the implications? More biodiversity, more ecosystem services, more human well-being. Therefore, you should be conserving biodiversity. Simple. So this is an argument, a framework created by conservation biologists who found that the argument that you should save tigers for their own sake, save whales for their own sake, or save penguins for their own sake was not getting much traction. So now we have to prove that saving whales, tigers and penguins is good for human well-being even in a material sense. And so we have to come up with this idea of ecosystem services. Ecosystems generate services which then contribute to human well-being. And this is caught on. I mean, if you look at if you just do Google search for the term ecosystem services, the graph is going like this. The graph is going like this in the scientific literature, because suddenly everybody is lashed onto this bandwagon and everybody is framing their argument in terms of ecosystem services. And the final term in terms of solutions then comes, then since I have anyway destroyed the biodiversity in my backyard 100 years ago, 200 years ago, there are no more lions in Britain for the last 500 years, there are no more large areas of biodiversity in the northern Americas anyway. Now it's actually the remaining biodiversity is all in the global south. So you guys please save the biodiversity for our sake. The our is of course this, as I said, we are all in the same boat kind of argument. And so please save that remaining biodiversity for our sake, while we of course continue to fly across the world to visit and see that biodiversity once in a while as ecotourists. Whether it's wildlife tourism in Africa or somebody visiting Nagarhole National Park in Karnataka, right? Or plant trees for us. So the new thing is nature-based solutions, which is another jargon for basically planting trees or forest land restoration. I'm sure you'll all run into these jargons as you go along. FLR, forest land restoration. So the word restoration is now just another buzzword for basically tree planting. And why do you plant trees? Because it will sequester carbon. And why should you sequester carbon? Because of course the global problem of climate change is there and everybody has to contribute. And it's very difficult for me to get out of my car, so why don't you just plant a few trees for me on your precious piece of land on which you were probably cultivating 1 acre of land of ragi or jowar or something. But now you please plant trees because it's a global problem, and biodiversity and nature-based solutions will solve all these global problems because biodiversity gives us human well-being, right? So that constant drumming of this idea is part of this building of a framework with the value. The hidden value is biodiversity. The framework has biodiversity in a corner somewhere. It claims that it's about everything, provisioning services and regulating services and blah blah blah. The hidden agenda is biodiversity. The framing is of ecosystem services giving us human well-being, and the solutions that follow from that are called nature-based solutions, called forest land restoration, or in its more extreme form called half-earth. Half-earth for nature. I don't know how many of you have heard of this. There's a website, you can look it up, half-earth for nature. So the proposal is that things are desperate on the biodiversity front and on the climate change front. Things are desperate. So half of Earth needs to be put under protected areas. Now you can guess without my telling you which half of Earth that is going to be. It's not going to be New York. It's not going to be London or Paris, right? Poor things. They lost their biodiversity long time. What to do? Papa, as they say, power fellows. So a more accurate, I would offer a more accurate framework of the relationship between the environment and society would have on one side biotic nature. It would probably divide biotic nature into two parts, the uncultivated half and the cultivated half, which is agriculture and aquaculture and so on, which are very different from your forests and natural grasslands. And yes, it is true that they do provide some amount of human well-being through these different services. But what we are missing in this framing or this picture is the abiotic nature, which is petroleum, coal, iron ore, bauxite, sand, limestone, you name it. All the stuff that post-industrial revolution particularly has become extremely significant in delivering human well-being. We just need to look around us and tell me one thing that is biotic here. Maybe the wooden door, possibly, for all I know it's something else. It's plastic made to look like wood. But everything else, whether the air conditioning that we are running it on or the chairs you are sitting on, everything, the PowerPoint I am using, is coming from abiotic nature. And that has been the source of human well-being, the increasing source of human well-being for the last 200 years. Essentially post-industrial revolution. And we have to stop kidding ourselves when we say that ecosystems contribute to human well-being. Even if you just take the basic needs of roti, kapda, makan, makan is now basically abiotic, kapda is now basically nylon, and roti is barely coming from the biotic, but with a huge amount of chemical and fertilizers, use of tractors, trucks to bring the rice from Punjab and Haryana to Kerala and wherever else. You name it, the abiotic has penetrated even into the very basic activity of food production, right? And so we are just fooling ourselves if we say that ecosystems provide human well-being. Because as you said, Manjula, it's the framing. What is left out? Framing is all about leaving out things that actually might be important. But you hide them because your agenda is to push just the biotic side of the story. And I think we need to really recognize this. We need to recognize that in fact, in exploiting abiotic nature, we destroy biotic nature. Once you do mining, you destroy the forests on top of that. That's part of the exploitation of abiotic nature and what it does. The exploitation of abiotic nature also produces pollutants and other kinds of hazards to human health while it provides us with well-being at the same time. So you have DDT which kills mosquitoes perhaps, but also gives you other kinds of side effects, and that's one of, again, thousands of such examples. And we also need to recognize the third yellow arrow, which is that biotic nature was never so wonderful and beautiful that it did not hurt human beings. And that biotic nature always produces disservices also. Elephants trample crops, tigers eat cows, if not human beings, mosquitoes give us all kinds of diseases. The coronavirus comes from biotic nature and has devastated the planet Earth, but nobody wants to talk about it as an ecosystem disservice. But that's what it is. And all of human history has been this constant struggle to balance between getting the benefits of nature while running away or controlling or mitigating the negative side of nature, whether it is by building houses that are pakka enough to withstand the rain, or whether it is other ways in which we keep nature out to some extent while at the same time wanting to benefit from it, right? So this, instead of recognizing this dual-edged nature of nature, If we only talk about nature as this lovely, beautiful thing, that's because you and I can then afford to live in air-conditioned houses and visit Nagarhole once in a while and go around in a safari in a jeep and not be worried about the tiger eating us while we go on that safari, right? In that context, nature is beautiful and wonderful because you can enjoy the tiger without all those other consequences, or the elephant without being trampled, and so on and so forth. But the tribal who's living next to Nagarhole National Park or inside Nagarhole National Park does not have those luxuries and is facing both ends of the sword, both sides of the story in some sense. So I think we need to really recognize that this is perhaps a more accurate understanding of the environment-society relationship as a very double-edged, complicated kind of relationship, whether it is the biotic side or the abiotic side. And therefore also the distributional question, it's not just human well-being in some homogeneous sense, but the question of equity in space and sustainability over time, that too is also very different from different ways of exploiting nature. And therefore we come to the conclusion that climate change is neither explained by biodiversity loss. Biodiversity loss did not create climate change was created by fossil fuel use, nor can it be solved by then restoring biodiversity or planting trees or FLR or whatever those new jargons are, because that's just a very small part of the whole story. And the real part of the story is fossil fuel use and how do you cut back on fossil fuel use. Let me then come to the last set of challenges. These are challenges so far that I talked about are internal to academia, whether it is the values that have penetrated our academic discourse, whether it is the frameworks that we are using, or the combination of these three things that, including then the solutions that we propound. External challenges begin by something which is perhaps not even external. The deans and the directors and the boards of institutes and universities are responsible for quantifying academic performance now on the basis of citation indices, impact factors, number of journal papers that you publish, etc., etc., etc. And that's the killer of real knowledge building. That's an absolutely guaranteed way of destroying genuine building of knowledge. Because we do not want to read what somebody else has written. We do not have the guts to evaluate what they have written and say whether it is a significant contribution or not. We just want to go by numbers. So sort of the pseudo-objectivity of all these numbers that we are promoting in our academic institutes. So as I said, not sure it's an external challenge, it's perhaps an internal hegemony of the quantitative guys over the qualitative guys. But the external challenge is real, declining state funding for social sciences and especially for the critical social sciences. More generally, if you look at society around us, the rejection of rational thought. And this extends beyond the social sciences into the natural realm as well. So people are still talking about the Ganesha idols that produce milk on certain days and all kinds of nonsensical stuff that is being promoted in the name of traditional knowledge and so on. This is a rising trend in our society, in many societies around the world. The rejection of science. And here I mean, as I said, science as a systematic way of understanding both the natural and the social domains. And funnily enough, even while we reject science, we deify technology. So the same guys who promote astrology are happy to use internet to promote astrology. Right? There suddenly their science is not telling them, well, on Mondays I should not use my mobile phone and on Tuesdays I should not touch my keyboard, and nothing of that sort is happening. So it's clearly that we don't want to talk about science while we want to enjoy the fruits of technology. So because technology is somehow this, I don't know what, coming from somewhere where it's a very depoliticized kind of thing. And it is reflected in the funding that currently the government does. It pumps money into technology, limited money into science, even less money into social science, and of course nothing into scientific temper. So we have a real problem there. And we have a larger problem of the rejection of ideas of equity, inclusion, justice, and democracy as values through which we need to understand social problems. Values through which we see society and values that we cherish in the kind of society we want to build. And as I tried to show in the earlier part of this talk, these are integral to environmental problems. Environmental problems don't exist mostly if you don't care about justice. Environmental problems don't exist as problems if you don't care about equity. If you don't care about future generations, is also a form of intergenerational justice. Caring about other species is, you could say, also interspecies justice. The rights of the tiger only come, and you can't be thinking about rights of the tiger without thinking about the rights of the slum dweller or the Adivasi and so on. That the humanities tell you that is pretty stupid. So I think we are really facing a major challenge. There is shrinking space for the ideas of equity and justice. The idea of how do we then resolve the environmental problems, because they are multivalent problems. Then multiple values are involved in framing of an environmental problem, and people will have, by definition, different notions of how much equity they want, how much sustainability they want, and how much they want to compromise sustainability vis-a-vis current enjoyment of their material well-being. There will be differences. So how do we then resolve these differences across people to arrive at societal decisions that requires democratic processes? Otherwise we will have the dictatorship of the technocrats, or the dictatorship of the bureaucrats, or the dictatorship of the business elite, who will then tell us what is the right mixture of sustainability, equity and well-being that we should be all consuming in some sense. So I think these are very real external challenges, and I'd like to run through a few responses that we might want to offer to these challenges. And I don't mean to say that the program here or other programs that I mentioned haven't already grappled with some of these responses or haven't incorporated these responses into their thinking. They very much have, but we need to build on those ideas and maybe expand them further or deepen them further. One is that we need to begin by embracing very actively a multidimensional value framework. We cannot limit ourselves to the idea of sustainability. We certainly cannot limit our ideas to conservation, and we need a socio-environmental developmentalism, as if I may coin a phrase, which includes human well-being, but also well-being of non-humans, the idea of sustainability and resilience, but also the value of equity and justice, and finally the idea of deep democracy for arriving at decisions over contested values and contested understandings. So I think we need to have something like this, which is multivalent, multidimensional in terms of the values that we hold, not just for the environmental side of the story, but for the non-environmental side of the story. As I said, these are very difficult to even unentangle, and for the ideas of development or the ideas of societal well-being as a whole. Secondly, I think our work has to focus on strengthening interdisciplinarity. And I'd like to begin by saying interdisciplinary courses are not just for students, but for faculty. I think I would not be wrong in saying the vast majority of my colleagues who are teaching in interdisciplinary programs have not necessarily come from an interdisciplinary training themselves. And so I think without making it into an issue of prestige, I think we should all think of retraining our faculty or expanding their horizons in terms of their understanding of the other, whatever that other might be for them. For the social scientists, it might be ecology, hydrology and chemistry or climatology, and vice versa for the natural scientists. And I think this is, and it's not just about learning the other, but also learning how to do the bridging. And within the social science, the problem of interdisciplinarity is not limited to the natural versus social domain, but we see a huge amount of fragmentation within the social sciences. The economists do not talk to the non-economists and so on and so forth. The critical social sciences don't talk necessarily to the positive social scientists. And I think we need to overcome that fragmentation and build an understanding of society which is multi-causal. So if I'm a gender person, I should not be thinking that all societal problems are explained through the gender lens, even though there may be elements of gender in all of these problems. I don't think we should try desperately to collapse caste, class, gender and everything else into one single monocausal explanation. We must embrace multi-causality within the social domain. And therefore, I think my message is unite and do not splinter. There are very few of us. There might be declining funding for whatever we are doing, and therefore it behooves on us to unite. Do not retreat into our smaller comfort zones. There is a tendency in academia to be centrifugal. So we take the idea of environment and then appropriate itself so that it becomes environmental philosophy, environmental economics, environmental sociology, environmental anthropology, environmental whatever. And so the anthropologists remain anthropologists with a little bit of environment, etc., etc. Right? That's just the centrifugal tendency of academia. We need to get over that, and we need to work together as centers or school of habitat studies or whatever we have in other universities to really focus on the environmental question more generally. So rather than the water question separate from the energy question, separate from the climate question and so on, I'm really happy to see that here we have environment climate change and sustainability all under one umbrella, and I would recommend expanding that umbrella even more. And if we are to be interdisciplinary, we need to explicitly bring interdisciplinarians on board. People who have learned to cross these divides and to teach how to cross these divides in our courses. So it's not enough to give a multidisciplinary coursework where you learn some social science and some natural science. That is necessary but not sufficient. We need to also explicitly train our students in doing the bridging. How do we link ecology with economics, ecology with anthropology, political economy with ecology, and so on and so forth. The gender analysis with understandings of ecology or chemistry and so on. So I think we need explicit attention to the interdisciplinary method and approach, and that will be fostered or will be strengthened if we work backwards rather than forwards. As academics, we learn some tools, we learn some theories, and then we go out looking for nails with which to hammer, given that I have the hammer to hit. But if we work backwards from problems and say we have to solve problems, and whatever theoretical and methodological lens/tool I need to use to understand and solve that problem, I will pick it up, I will deploy it, I or we. Therefore, team research I think becomes absolutely important in this context. Team research, in order to collectively understand and solve problems, is one way of strengthening our interdisciplinarity and making it real. Thirdly, the tyranny of global framing. I think we have to remain grounded in the South Asian context and build South-South exchanges and linkages much more strongly. We need to expand our focus from the traditional areas of forests, agriculture, water, and so on, which is sort of more on the production side, to include questions of consumption, the urban lifestyles that produce environmental impacts far away, and the questions of consumerism. And there is no question that these external constraints are daunting, but private donors are stepping up to some extent. Even traditional science and technology institutes, like for instance the IITs, are opening up to the idea of setting up interdisciplinary centers. And in fact, these programs, these 4 or 5 or 6 programs that have conducted environmental studies, research and teaching in environmental studies over the last 10-20 years, have generated a massive alumni network that I think we need to see as a source of strength and a source of sustenance to support these programs as we go along. My final word is that the greatest source of hope is the people I see in this room. This photograph, although truncated from the top, I'm sure all of you can guess what that word at the top is. It's Chhatrao Hamara Salam, because it's really only the students, current and future, who are going to carry this work forward and push for both, create the demand for this kind of program or multiple such programs. They will push. It is up to us to respond, and by us I mean the faculty here and across all the universities that have such programs. Thank you.
So floor is now open to ask questions. Because of the time constraint, we are limiting it to 5 questions. Please shoot.
And more specifically, when you say the hegemony of science, actually, so my question is related to that part. When we talk about hegemony of science, there is also an element of called hegemony of social science, which doesn't allow science to penetrate into the domain actually. So I think a very good example is JNU, and because the JNU is a university which has multidisciplinary subject, but the environmental science discipline is completely in silo actually. So why this is happening actually, especially in the social science domain, the science is not allowed actually.
I'm reminded of Schumacher's point when he wrote Small is Beautiful, where he said that it's not that small is beautiful in an absolute sense, but then when there is a tyranny of the big, we have to emphasize the value of the small. So when there is a tyranny of the natural science, we have to emphasize the value of the social science. But it does not mean that the social science is not prone to its own tyrannies. As I said, academia in general is centrifugal. So we all build walls, create our silos, and do a lot of gatekeeping. And the social sciences as a whole, I noticed that because of the chip in the shoulder, which is rightly so, that all the big money is going to the natural sciences. I tease my wife that her institute's budget alone, which was for the field of astronomy, was more than the ICSSR budget for 26 social science institutions. So given that kind of a disparity, it's natural that the social scientists develop a chip in their shoulder and become even more siloed, because they have been told that their science is subjective, it is qualitative, therefore it's really not science at all, and it's a waste of time and money, public money, to even invest in social science. So that creates a reaction, which is what I talked about, the denial or the rejection or the denigration of the natural sciences becomes part of that reaction. So I would just explain it that way.
So, sir, my query is कि in the initial part of the discussion, you said कि a lot of institutes are still not considering environmental studies as their primary focus area. Only a handful of institutes are just focusing on that thing. So, my query is कि what will it take to nudge these institutes to realize the actual value of environmental studies in general, rather than just environmental sciences? That is not only focusing on the physical sciences or the natural sciences aspect.
That's a million rupee question. I think if the UGC believed that the environment was an interdisciplinary field of study, then they would promote that. They would push it down the university's throats in some sense to move from environment science to environment studies. I don't know if that's a great idea to initiate this change top down. But I think the fact that the universities are still stuck in the science mindset is just a reflection of the larger problem we have in our society, right? From 10th standard onwards, I am asked to specialize. 10वीं के बाद I am told कि you have to choose science, arts or commerce. Then you have to choose science, either medical or engineering or something. And in a sense, if you have not chosen science, then you are like low in the pecking order anyway. So this separation and fragmentation is so deeply ingrained in our education system. The very fact that, okay, now NEP talks about major, minor, and talks about people being able to take classes across these disciplinary boundaries. We have to wait and see whether it really happens. I think if it happens to even, let's say, 20% of what NEP thinks it should happen, then it might translate into these programs opening up. That's
the solution is mostly political.
Well, I mean, life is all that way.
Thank you.
That's a question.
Hello, sir. My name is Advait. Firstly, thank you so much for enriching with your knowledge. And secondly, I would like to ask, there has always been a problem of pollution in Delhi, and it is believed that it is largely because of the burning of paddy that happens in Haryana and Punjab. And the one thing that can be done is to use machineries like Happy Seeders, but the farmers are not able to pay so much for it, and so they resort to burning. So, and it is because of that, the economical toll, they can't do anything else. So what, according to you, is the solution to it?
I was not expecting to solve environment problems sitting here in half an hour. So I won't venture to give you an answer to the problem as such. I'd just like to tell you to explore other dimensions of the problem. So for instance, there is an interplay between the water question and the agricultural question and the pollution. Punjab passed laws in order to save groundwater. They passed laws about not planting paddy when the rains have not come. So the planting time of paddy was postponed legally by about a month. People are prevented from using, people wanted to use borewells. People historically started using borewells, and that led to groundwater depletion. In order to prevent that, they have asked the farmers to postpone the planting till when the rain comes so that you don't need to pump groundwater. What that does is then that postpones the time of harvest. Then they have not enough time left to actually manage the stubble in a different way before the next planting has to happen. And so there is an interconnection between so it's a really complicated problem. That you want to save groundwater, but then you have a problem of timing of planting and therefore timing of harvesting, and therefore the even more need to burn stubble. There is the larger question of why are we growing so much paddy in the first place, right? And so on and so forth. So I would just like you to explore these dimensions rather than give you any particular solution. There is no one solution to this wicked problem.
Good evening, sir. Really eye-opening presentation. First of all, I would like to say that. Before this presentation, even I thought, I can contribute to the environment by planting trees and everything. But things on a global as well as a local level are very different. But how do you actually, convey this to common people? Because when we go outside, we're talking to people who are probably not that privileged to get this kind of a platform. And if we tell them, hey, what you are actually trying to do, planting trees, conserving forests, are actually not going to change the climate issue, how do you convey those things? People might get, it's kind of like brainwashing them or like, changing their entire perspective about how to save the environment. So how do we go about to, change, bring that perspective and spread awareness about that to common people?
So hopefully what we are doing here is not brainwashing. I was hoping not to do it. I think you underestimate people's capacities to actually engage. Number one, of course, in the context of climate change, the average person on the street has a CO2 footprint of under 2 tons per capita per year. They are not even a source of the problem. The Earth system can still absorb, if everybody goes to 2 tons per capita per year, the Earth system can probably still absorb all that CO2, right? So in a sense, we don't have to tell them to reduce their footprint. Right? So then we have to ask them, what is the question that is hurting them the most? What is the environmental problem that is hurting them the most? Which might be air pollution in Delhi, it might be water pollution, it might be sheer water scarcity and the fact that they have to stand in line for 3 hours in the morning or get up at 4 a.m. to fill their buckets. The whole variety of environmental problems, some of them we don't even see as environmental problems. We say, oh, that's a developmental problem. Roti, kapda, makan, pani, bijli, sadak, these are all developmental problems. But everything has an environmental or biophysical dimension to it. Bijli is not produced just like that, right? So I think we need to go down and ask people what are the problems that they really face and try to understand those problems. But at the same time, I think if we explain how current life production and consumption have separated, so that what they are consuming, even the poor person is consuming rice obtained through PDS, which is coming from Punjab and Haryana, which they have never seen in their life. What is Punjab and what is Haryana, and what is happening to groundwater there because of the growing of paddy and wheat or sugarcane. I think people will understand if it is communicated in straightforward terms. The fact that there is this separation, and therefore we need to worry about it much more than we used to worry about in the past. Right?
My question is, how do you hold somebody accountable? Like you have people like Kylie Jenner who takes 5 flights on her private jet every day for a distance which would take her 45 minutes to drive. So even if I plant 10 trees every single day for the rest of my life, I'm obviously not going to sequester her carbon. So how do you hold people like that accountable?
I think we'll have to get rid of page 3 from the newspapers. Right? Because that's where their whole power is coming from. Because they think of themselves as great and we are actually calling them great. We are consuming their greatness in some sense. And that's what creates this whole possibility that they could do these crazy things. I think if through a combination of ignoring them and actually not consuming what a product that they are selling to us directly or indirectly is going to be part of the solution. You have to boycott people, whether it's their music, whether it's their movies, whether it's whatever it is that they are producing, if they are living these kind of crazy lifestyles.
Sir, my question is, in one of your slides of what should be our response, you mentioned about something like opposing the tyranny of global farming. So I want to know about this, more about this tyranny of global farming, and is that somewhere related to the 2020 farm bill?
I don't know if that was a typing error in my slide. I meant the tyranny of global frameworks, framing. So what I mentioned in the early part about the idea of ecosystem services or the idea of planetary boundaries, the idea that all environmental problems are important only when they are considered as global problems. That is the tyranny that I am talking about.
Thank you, Sharat. It's always been enlightening to listen to your presentations. My question is, I'm just wondering about, you said rejection of science is a growing trend. But how do you understand it? Because I think rejection of science is a growing trend is not just because people want it, but it is also about accessibility to science, that people. This is one aspect, but there is another aspect to it also. It is also about increasing cultural hegemony that science actually challenges. So how do you actually try to encompass these particular issues in terms of understanding the kind of issues that we are struggling as environmental scientists?
So as there is no question in my mind that the rejection of science, or if we turn it around and say the project of spreading scientific temper. India is the only country in the world which has written that idea into its constitution. Under the directive principles, we have the idea that we must spread the scientific temper. And in spite of that, we have a science on the retreat, or scientific temper on the retreat. While science institutions may be flourishing, money for science might be increasing, all that is absolutely, this dichotomy between scientific temper, which is simply the idea that everything that we do in our daily lives has to be seen through a lens of rationality and evaluated through the idea of rationality, through systematic evaluation and thinking, logic and so on. This is eroding even while we pour money into some elite science institutions or research and so on. So I think this contradiction is very rightly, as you said, related to cultural hegemony. A particular phase that we are going through right now where certain ideas of traditional cultures having been superior and already having had aircrafts and test tube babies 10,000 years ago and so on and so forth, is part of this larger project. Right? It's part of a larger project. I mean, it's not the idea of those technologies existing 5,000 years ago is not central to that project. The project is of a particular kind, of a certain cultural domination. So one can also say that's also hopeful because these projects will come and go, but hopefully we can keep pushing the idea of scientific temper, and that's definitely a political idea because it questions these projects. It's not just about understanding whether tree planting leads to river rejuvenation. That's just one idea of scientific temper, but that's actually more complicated because when you try to explain hydrology, it takes some time. But I think you can explain the contradictions of astrology much faster. So I think, therefore it is a political project to talk about scientific temper. There's no denying it. We have to continue to do that. That's all.
Okay, now like how Professor Lele was ended the thing, listening to the voice of hope, see our student, who is an agricultural student, who is doing very interesting work. So just listen. Am I audible? Okay. So listen to that voice of hope,
Hello. Sanju here. So Sanju is our alumni. Basically, he is from the third batch of climate change program. He's running Sustera Foundation and actually doing climate change awareness among many people actually. So what I would have requested at the moment, he is in UK and enjoying his UK visit. So I requested him to have a 5-minute discussion so that he can talk about his experience with climate change program as well as what he is doing at the moment on climate change front. So over to you, Sanju.
Hello everyone. Thank you, Dr. Kamal. I was not able to completely hear what you had said. Also, even Sharach's session, I was not able to completely hear, probably because of the issue of the mic or so. Anyhow, thanks a lot for inviting me here, and a very big hi from my side to all of you. It's really a pleasure to be here and talk to you. And it's also nostalgic for me to, I used to sit in that room, and it makes me happy to see you all being there. And yeah. Anyhow, so Dr. Kamal had asked me to, at this occasion of 10 years of the course, he had asked me to give, share my experience and also what myself and some of my colleagues are doing now in terms of the work contributing towards the space or the sector. So this is a complete nostalgia for me. It has given me enormous experiences over the period of 2 years, and I was lucky and to be part at that point of time to be in TISS to create the kind of network that I have, and also the learnings I got. I came from a background with a psychology background. I did my graduation in psychology and then I moved into the area of climate change. So it was pretty new for me, the subject, even though there was passion in me to work on climate related issues. I didn't know much, and understanding the science was quite a tough task. The same way, a lot of the sessions and FCs and classes that I was part of, at least in the first semester, made no sense to me, or I just didn't understand. But slowly things evolved, and yes, over the next couple of months, it was an amazing experience altogether. The course as such it started 10 years back, and it has created lots of professionals that are working in various parts of the world, trying to solve the issue related to climate change in their own little ways, or contributing to larger causes. And some are working in the scientific domain, some are working on the corporate domain, supporting ESG and so on, some are working in the grassroots. So there is a diverse set of members who are working on various issues associated with climate change. And first of all, a big hats off to all of them, and you also, all of you sitting here, because this has become the need of the moment, and we being part of a larger community, a larger nation which is on the receiving end of impacts of climate change, it makes more sense to have more professionals coming out who can work on solving it and helping people build resilience, helping people to adapt and even to mitigate it. So TISS gave me, TISS was, the course at TISS, the course was more of creating people who are jack of all trades, and that was what is required. After the course, after 2 years, we knew a little about everything, which was quite important as we moved into the field, and that really helped a lot, because a lot of courses are quite specific in terms of either energy or sustainable development only, or water, etc. But this course was diverse, and that diversity really helped us prosper, as we go ahead. And that also helped a lot in people finding various domains to work with, and various interests to work with. Some of the some of the most learning happened as well during the field works, the urban and rural ones, especially where, for the rural field work we were in Gondia, and the work with Mr. Gidanchoy and everyone really led to some impacts as well, which we are all very proud of. The same with urban field work as well, taught us a lot about the major development issues that Mumbai faces. And while at this, I was fortunate to also make a lot of friends from other courses, which really helped me think even higher, because communicating with the various courses and various branches really helped me a lot. Those conversations, those interactions we had really helped us a lot. Personally, then I was fortunate enough to be able to intern in Ladakh with an organization called Ladakh Ecological Development Group, which was also amazing. And the wonderful faculty that we have, the freedom that they give, and the library, all of it was a different experience for us. Really proud that I was part of the cohort. And really, the next biggest thing that we need is to have more courses in more universities, and even this launching yet another courses specific to various domains of sustainability and climate change. I hope in the coming years that would happen. Apart from that, I will also just introduce to my work. I'm CEO of Sastra Foundation, which is an organization extensively working on creating development professionals, training young passionate leaders who want to work in the climate domain. I started my career with Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment, where over a period of 4 years in Alappuzha in Mohamba, we worked with the community and various other stakeholders to develop a model wetland village. Later on, while being at A3 itself, I co-founded Sastra Foundation and Nava, which was a social enterprise which worked on upcycling and at the same time, Sastra Foundation predominantly focused on creating more young, passionate leaders who could work in their own communities to solve the climate crisis. So what we are trying to do is that in every state in India, we're trying to do climate leadership programs, which is more of a 2-month program, which provides passionate youngsters the necessary skill, knowledge, and network to work in their communities to solve the climate crisis-based issues. And that has been going well with the various networks that we have. We are trying to scale up this work as fast as possible. And a big thanks to all the faculty and all the members there at TISS and all the 100+ years of experience that TISS has, which has led to creating a diverse set of development professionals. So wishing you all the best and wishing you regards from all our alumni as well. Thank you, and yeah. I'm not able to hear, hope you were able to hear, and if you have any questions you can, or else I will sign up.
Sanju, we all are clapping for you.
Hopefully I will be able to hear clapping with you. Sanju, can you hear it?
I did see though.
Oh, good. So, thank you very much, Sanju, for giving your time and sharing your experiences with us. I think we are, partly because of the technical issues, we started really late today, and we've actually taken out your gathering in Anna Tapuri actually. So anyway, it's a very nice lecture. Sir, actually, really wonderful lecture today. I hope all of you will enjoy. With this, actually, I'll ask Varun to give a vote of thanks, and then we'll end.
Thank you, sir. So, I thank the entire audience, student community. I see alumni sitting here, faculties, Dean ma'am, and all the other people to mark their presence during this celebration of our decadal event of the program called Environment, Climate Change and Sustainability Studies in School of Habitat Studies. Thank you. Sir, I especially thank you for sparing time from a busy schedule and enlightening students and giving some insightful know-how about various facets of this wonderful topic, which is environmental science to environmental studies and the face of various hegemonies. Thank you, sir.